A homeless Navy SEAL thought the war had taken everything, until a stranger he once saved left him a farm and a fight. Cold wind rolled across the Montana bus station parking lot the morning Ethan Walker woke inside his rusted pickup. His only companion, a scarred German shepherd named Ranger. He believed his life after war would be nothing but empty roads and sleepless nights, until a lawyer's call revealed a forgotten rescue had changed someone's life and left Ethan a farm worth fighting for. Comment 1 if you believe loyalty can change a life, or 0 if you think fate decides everything, and tell us where you're watching from. The first light of dawn crept slowly across the mountains of western Montana, spilling pale gray light over the quiet streets of Missoula. The air carried the sharp chill of late autumn, the kind that slipped through seams in jackets and settled deep in the bones. Frost clung to the sidewalks, and the sky hung low and heavy above the town like a sheet of cold steel. At the far edge of a nearly empty bus station parking lot sat an old 2006 Chevy Silverado. Its faded paint bore the scars of many miles, scratches across the doors, a dented rear bumper, and dust that had long ago settled into every crease of its aging metal. Inside the truck, a man shifted slightly beneath a thin wool blanket. Ethan Walker woke the way he had learned to wake years ago, slowly, carefully, his senses sharpening before his eyes even opened. The habit had never left him. 14 years in the United States Navy, most of them spent with SEAL teams in places far from home, had trained his body to stay alert even in sleep. Even now, long after he had left the military, his mind still scanned the world for danger before allowing him to move. He opened his eyes. For a moment, he stared at the fogged windshield inches from his face. His breath had left faint circles of condensation on the glass during the night, and a thin crust of frost had formed along the edges of the window. Ethan pushed himself upright slowly. At 39 years old, his body still carried the strength of a man who had spent most of his life carrying heavy gear through hostile terrain. His shoulders were broad, his forearms thick and marked with faint scars that told quiet stories of long-forgotten missions. But exhaustion had carved its own marks into him. His dark hair, once kept short in strict military fashion, had grown uneven in recent months. Threads of gray had begun appearing near his temples. A few days of rough stubble shadowed his jaw. The most noticeable thing about Ethan Walker, though, was his eyes. They were a pale, icy blue, eyes that never seemed to stop watching. A soft movement beside him broke the stillness. Ethan turned his head slightly. Amber eyes met his. "Morning, Ranger," Ethan muttered quietly. The German shepherd lifted his head from the seat beside him. Ranger was large even for his breed, nearly 90 pounds of muscle beneath thick black and tan fur. His ears stood alert and forward, and his steady gaze carried the calm intelligence of a dog that had spent years working alongside soldiers in dangerous places. He had once been a military working dog assigned to the same SEAL unit Ethan served with overseas. They had been partners during Ethan's final deployment. When Ethan left the service after a roadside explosion left him battling severe panic attacks and sleepless nights, Ranger had left with him. Some bonds formed in war never truly break. Ranger stretched slightly and nudged Ethan's arm with his nose. The message was clear. Time to move. Ethan rubbed his hands over his face, trying to push away the stiffness of another night spent sleeping in a truck. "Yeah," he said softly. "I know." Outside, the parking lot remained quiet, except for the occasional hum of a distant car passing along the main road. The bus station itself stood nearly empty at this hour, its fluorescent lights casting a faint glow through the glass entrance doors. Ethan pulled on a worn canvas jacket and stepped out of the truck. The cold hit him immediately. Montana mornings had a way of reminding people that nature was always stronger. His boots crunched softly across the thin layer of frost, as Ranger hopped down beside him. The dog moved with disciplined awareness, scanning the area instinctively. Even after leaving the military, Ranger still carried the habits of a working canine. Ethan walked across the empty lot toward a small strip of grass beside the sidewalk. While Ranger handled his morning routine, Ethan studied the quiet town waking slowly around him. A delivery truck rumbled past in the distance. A metal door slammed somewhere behind the bus station. The sound cracked through the air like a gunshot. Ethan flinched before he could stop himself. For a split second, the world shifted. Dust-filled roads, burning vehicles, shouts over a radio. His chest tightened. Then Ranger pressed his body firmly against Ethan's leg. The steady warmth of the dog grounded him. The images faded. Ethan exhaled slowly. "I'm good," he whispered. Ranger remained beside him a moment longer before trotting back toward the truck. When they climbed back inside the Silverado, Ethan reached for his phone. The screen glowed faintly in the dim light. No new messages. No missed calls. 3 weeks earlier, he had applied for a security job at a warehouse. Before that, a delivery position. Before that, maintenance work at a construction company. Each time the conversation had gone the same way. "Thank you for your service. We'll be in touch." They never were. Ethan glanced at his bank app. $32. He turned the phone off. 2 more days, he muttered quietly. Ranger watched him from the passenger seat, calm and patient as always. The dog never seemed to worry about tomorrow. Ethan wished he knew how to do that. He started the engine. The Silverado coughed once before settling into a rough idle. They drove through the quiet streets of Missoula until they reached a small diner near the edge of town. The neon sign flickered weakly in the morning light. Inside, the diner smelled of bacon grease and burnt coffee. A waitress behind the counter looked up as Ethan walked in. Her name tag read Linda. She offered a small smile when she saw Ranger. "Well now," she said, "that's a handsome partner you got there." Ethan nodded politely. "His name's Ranger." Ranger sat quietly beside the booth while Ethan wrapped his hands around a mug of hot coffee. For a few minutes, the world felt calm. Then his phone buzzed. The number on the screen was unfamiliar. Ethan frowned slightly before answering. "Ethan Walker." A calm male voice responded on the other end. "Mr. Walker? My name is Harold Whitaker. I'm an attorney calling from Wichita, Kansas." Ethan leaned back slightly in the booth. "Kansas?" he repeated. "Yes, sir." The lawyer paused briefly. "I realize this call may sound unusual, but you've recently been named the beneficiary in a will." Ethan blinked. "I think you've got the wrong number." "I assure you we do not." There was a brief shuffle of papers on the other end of the line. "A gentleman named Daniel Boone Carter passed away 3 weeks ago. According to his final will, you have inherited his farm." Ethan stared out the diner window. The Montana sky hung gray and endless above the town. "I don't know anyone named Daniel Carter," he said slowly. The lawyer's voice remained calm. "According to his records, Mr. Carter knew you." Ethan shook his head. "That's impossible." There was another pause. Then the lawyer said quietly, "Mr. Walker, Mr. Carter believed you once saved his life." Ethan felt a strange stillness settle inside his chest. He looked down at Ranger. The dog's amber eyes met his. For a moment, neither of them moved. Ethan finally spoke. "I think," he said quietly, "you've got the wrong man." But something in the back of his mind had already begun to stir. A memory he couldn't quite reach. A moment lost somewhere in the chaos of another life. And for the first time in a very long time, Ethan Walker felt the faintest whisper of something he had nearly forgotten. Possibility. The word sat quietly in the back of his mind as the lawyer's voice continued through the phone. "Mr. Walker, Harold Whitaker said calmly. I understand this may sound confusing, but the documents are very clear. Daniel Boone Carter named you personally in his will. Ethan stared through the diner window at the gray Montana morning. Cars rolled slowly past the intersection outside. A delivery driver unloaded crates near the grocery store across the street. Everything in the world looked normal, steady, predictable. None of it made sense anymore. I think you've got the wrong guy, Ethan said again. According to Mr. Carter's records, the lawyer replied, you served in the United States Navy between 2006 and 2020. Several deployments with special operations units. Ethan didn't answer. Whitaker continued. One of those deployments took place in northern Syria roughly 9 years ago. Your team responded to an emergency extraction involving American civilians working on an agricultural reconstruction project. A faint pressure began building in Ethan's chest. Dust. Heat. The sound of rotor blades somewhere overhead. The memory sat just out of reach. Whitaker spoke again. Mr. Carter was one of the civilians in that convoy. Ethan's fingers tightened slightly around the phone. You helped evacuate him during an attack, Whitaker said. For a moment, the diner disappeared. The smell of burnt coffee faded. In its place came the distant crack of rifle fire. A damaged truck sitting crooked across a narrow road. A group of terrified civilians crouched behind concrete barriers. And one older man with blood on his sleeve, refusing to climb into the evacuation vehicle until the others were safe. Ethan closed his eyes. He remembered grabbing the man by the arm, dragging him toward the armored transport as bullets snapped through the air. It had lasted maybe 3 minutes. 4 at most. Then the helicopters had arrived. Mission complete. Just another moment inside a long war. Ethan opened his eyes again. That was him? He said quietly. Yes, sir, Whitaker answered. Ethan leaned back in the booth. I never even knew his name. The lawyer's voice softened slightly. Mr. Carter knew yours. Ranger lifted his head beneath the table, sensing the shift in Ethan's breathing. Whitaker continued. After returning to the United States, Mr. Carter spent several months attempting to locate the unit responsible for that evacuation. Eventually, he was able to identify you as the soldier who pulled him into the vehicle. Ethan rubbed his jaw slowly. So he tracked me down? Not exactly, Whitaker said. According to his notes, he decided not to contact you directly. He believed soldiers deserved the chance to leave war behind without strangers reopening those memories. The lawyer paused. But he never forgot what you did. Ethan stared down at the wooden table. The grain of the wood blurred slightly as he tried to process what he was hearing. Whitaker continued speaking, in the calm voice of someone explaining a carefully documented history. Daniel Boone Carter owned a large farm in the Flint Hills region of Kansas. It had been in his family for nearly 70 years. Mr. Carter had no children, no immediate family left to inherit the land. And when his health began declining last year, Whitaker said, he made a decision. Ethan's voice came out rough. To leave it to me. Yes, sir. The words hung in the air between them. Ethan let out a quiet breath. I'm sleeping in a truck, he said finally. Whitaker didn't sound surprised. Mr. Carter was aware that your circumstances had changed after you left the service. Ethan frowned. How the hell would he know that? Mr. Carter kept an eye on the news and public records, Whitaker explained gently. He wanted to make sure the man who saved his life was doing well. Ethan shook his head slowly. That's crazy. Whitaker's voice remained steady. In his will, Mr. Carter wrote something very specific. There was a rustle of paper. Then the lawyer read aloud. The young man who pulled me out of that valley gave me the chance to come home again. I believe a man like that deserves land worth building a future on. Ethan felt something shift inside him, a strange pressure behind his ribs. For years he had believed that everything the war had given him was loss. Friends buried, nightmares that never quite faded. A life that felt like it had stopped moving forward. But somewhere out there, an old farmer had remembered that moment very differently. To Daniel Boone Carter, that day had been the beginning of the rest of his life. Whitaker cleared his throat gently. "Mr. Walker, if you choose to accept the inheritance, the Carter Ridge farm legally becomes yours." Ethan looked down. Ranger had placed his head quietly against Ethan's boot. The dog's calm weight felt steady and certain. Ethan reached down and scratched behind Ranger's ear. "What happens if I don't accept it?" he asked. "Then the property will be auctioned and absorbed by the county," Whitaker replied. Ethan looked back toward the window. Snow clouds had begun forming along the distant mountains. Montana winters came early. And they came hard. "How big is this place?" Ethan asked. "Approximately 800 acres, Whitaker said. Ethan almost laughed. 800 acres? "Yes, sir." The number sounded impossible. Ethan glanced down at Ranger again. The dog's amber eyes met his. For years, the road ahead had always looked the same. Another town, another job application, another night sleeping in the truck. Nothing waiting. But now, somewhere far beyond the mountains, a piece of land existed with his name written on it. Whitaker spoke again. "I can arrange transportation if necessary, Mr. Walker. The documents require your signature in person." Ethan thought for a long moment. Outside, the wind pushed a swirl of dry leaves across the street. Ranger waited quietly. Finally, Ethan spoke. "How far is Wichita from here?" Whitaker gave a faint chuckle. "A little over 1,400 miles. Ethan leaned back in the booth. "That's one hell of a drive." "Yes, sir." Ethan nodded slowly. Then he said something he hadn't expected to say that morning. "All right." There was a pause on the other end of the phone. "You'll come?" Ethan looked at Ranger again. The dog's tail thumped softly once against the diner floor. "Yeah," Ethan said quietly. "I guess I will." 4 days later, the Montana mountains were far behind him. The old Silverado rolled south along a narrow highway that cut through the open plains of Kansas. The land here looked completely different from the rugged valleys Ethan had left behind. Instead of towering pine forests and snow-covered ridges, the world stretched outward in endless waves of grass and farmland. The sky seemed impossibly wide. Late afternoon sunlight poured across the plains, turning the tall grass into rolling fields of gold that shimmered with every gust of wind. Ethan rested one hand loosely on the steering wheel as the truck bounced along the gravel road leading toward the Carter Ridge property. Beside him, Ranger sat upright in the passenger seat, watching the unfamiliar landscape with steady attention. The long drive had been quiet. Ethan had spent most of it thinking about the man he barely remembered. Daniel Boone Carter, a farmer, an engineer, a stranger who had carried the memory of a 3-minute rescue for nearly a decade. The gravel road curved gently around a small cluster of cottonwood trees, and then the land opened up. Ethan slowed the truck. "Well," he murmured softly, "that must be it." Carter Ridge Farm stretched across the hills ahead of him. The property rolled outward for what looked like mousses. Fields of tall grass and patches of cultivated soil formed wide rectangles across the land. Some sections were dark and freshly turned, while others looked abandoned, their soil dry and pale beneath the Kansas sun. At the center of the property stood a weathered farmhouse. The house was simple but sturdy, 2 stories of white-painted wood that had faded and peeled under years of prairie wind. A wide porch wrapped around the front, and two old rocking chairs sat near the railing as if someone had just stepped away for a moment. Beyond the house stood a large red barn. Even from a distance, Ethan could see where storms had battered the structure over the years. Several sheets of roofing metal hung slightly loose along the upper frame, and one corner of the building leaned just enough to suggest that repairs had been delayed for too long. The Silverado rolled slowly up the dirt driveway. When Ethan cut the engine, the world fell quiet. No traffic, no distant city noise, only wind moving softly through the grass. Ranger jumped down from the truck first. The German Shepherd immediately began exploring, his nose close to the ground as he moved across the yard with careful curiosity. His ears flicked at every sound, the creak of the barn doors, the distant rustle of dry grass shifting in the breeze. Ethan stepped out and stood beside the truck. For a long moment, he simply looked around. "This place is bigger than I expected," he muttered. Ranger barked once in agreement. The farmhouse door creaked open with a soft groan when Ethan pushed it. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old wood and dust. But the house wasn't abandoned. It felt paused. The living room still held furniture arranged neatly around a small stone fireplace. A bookshelf lined one wall, filled with old farming manuals and weather journals. Photographs hung in simple wooden frames along the hallway. Most of them showed the same man, Daniel Boone Carter. In one picture, he stood beside a rusted tractor with a wide grin beneath a gray mustache. In another, he leaned against a wooden fence while a field of wheat stretched behind him like an ocean of gold. Ethan studied the photographs quietly. "You built all this," he murmured. Ranger wandered through the room, sniffing carefully before settling near the door. Ethan spent the rest of the afternoon walking the land. The farm was even larger than it had looked from the road. Irrigation pipes stretched across several sections of the property, though many of them ended abruptly in the middle of the fields. Some connections had been installed properly, while others remained unfinished, metal joints waiting to be sealed, valves that had never been attached. It looked like Carter had been expanding the system before he died. But the work had stopped halfway. Near the barn, Ethan discovered 3 tractors. One of them looked newer, but the other 2 had clearly been sitting unused for months. Dust coated the engines, and the tires had sunk slightly into the dry soil beneath them. Ethan climbed into the cab of the nearest tractor and turned the key. The engine coughed once, then died. "Figures," he said quietly. He climbed back down and rubbed the back of his neck. "I don't know the first thing about farming," he admitted. Ranger sat nearby, watching him patiently. As the sun dipped lower toward the horizon, the Kansas sky began filling with soft shades of orange and violet. The wind carried the smell of dry soil and distant crops. Ethan walked back toward the farmhouse porch and sat heavily in one of the old rocking chairs. The wood creaked beneath his weight. Ranger lay down beside the steps. For the first time since arriving, Ethan allowed himself to breathe. The land stretched endlessly before him, beautiful, but intimidating. A place like this didn't just require work, it demanded it. Ethan leaned forward and rested his elbows on his knees. "What do you think, partner?" he asked quietly. Ranger lifted his head. His tail thumped once against the wooden porch. Ethan smiled faintly. "Yeah," he said. "I guess we'll figure it out." But as the last light of the day faded across the wide Kansas hills, Ethan Walker couldn't shake the quiet feeling growing in the back of his mind. This farm wasn't just land. It was unfinished. Something Daniel Boone Carter had started but never completed. And somehow, for reasons Ethan still didn't fully understand, the old farmer had trusted him to finish it. The Kansas sunrise arrived quietly. A soft golden light rolled over the Flint Hills and spilled across Carter Ridge Farm, painting the wide grasslands in shades of amber and pale green. A thin mist clung to the low valleys, slowly dissolving as the morning wind began to move across the land. Ethan Walker stood on the porch of the farmhouse holding a steaming mug of coffee he had found in the kitchen cabinet. The mug was chipped along the rim, its faded lettering reading simply, Carter Ridge. The wind carried the scent of dry earth and distant wheat. Below the porch steps, Ranger stretched his long body and trotted out across the yard, already beginning his morning patrol. Ethan watched him go. "Guess you're the security department," he muttered. The dog's ears flicked slightly, but he didn't look back. Ethan took a sip of coffee and studied the land again. Yesterday evening, the farm had looked peaceful. This morning, it looked enormous, and problems had already begun revealing themselves. The first issue appeared when Ethan walked out to inspect the irrigation lines. The metal pipes stretched across large portions of the fields, but several of the joints were loose or unfinished. Some valves had rusted slightly from exposure to the elements. In other places, the pipes simply ended, pointing toward distant fields that had never received water. Ethan crouched beside one of the valves and twisted the handle carefully. Nothing happened. "Good start," he muttered. Ranger barked suddenly from across the field. Ethan turned to see the dog standing beside a patch of tall grass, staring down at the ground. "What is it?" Ranger pawed at the grass. Ethan walked over. A thin trickle of water had begun leaking from a cracked joint in the pipe beneath the weeds. "Well, that explains the mud," Ethan said quietly. He knelt down and tightened the connection with a rusted wrench he had found in the barn earlier. The leak slowed, then stopped. Ethan leaned back on his heels. "One problem down," he said. Ranger wagged his tail once. The barn presented the next challenge. Inside, the structure smelled of old hay, machine oil, and dust that had settled over everything like a second skin. The tractors Ethan had noticed the day before stood in a row against the far wall. He climbed into the cab of the smallest one again. This time he opened the engine panel first. The battery cable was loose. Fuel lines were partially clogged. And judging by the thick dust covering the air filter, the machine hadn't run in a long time. Ethan sighed. "Okay," he said softly. "Two problems." By midday, the sun had risen high above the plains, warming the fields and sending long waves of heat shimmering above the soil. Ethan had managed to repair one irrigation valve and reconnect two sections of pipe. It wasn't much, but it was something. He was walking back toward the farmhouse when the sound of an engine drifted across the property. Ranger stopped instantly. His body stiffened as he turned toward the road. A dusty blue pickup truck rolled slowly down the dirt driveway. The vehicle stopped near the fence line, and the driver stepped out. The man looked to be in his early 50s. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-darkened skin and thick hands that carried the unmistakable marks of decades spent working outdoors. A faded work shirt hung loosely over his frame, and a wide-brimmed hat cast a shadow across his weathered face. He studied Ethan for a moment. Then he walked forward. "Morning," the man called. Ethan nodded politely. "Morning." The stranger glanced down at Ranger, who stood calmly beside Ethan, but watched him with careful attention. "That's a serious dog," the man said. "His name's Ranger," Ethan replied. The man smiled faintly. "Name's Caleb Torres," he said, extending a hand. "I run the ranch just east of here." Ethan shook his hand. "Ethan Walker." Caleb nodded toward the fields stretching behind Ethan. "So you're the one who inherited Carter's place?" "Looks like it." Caleb studied the property for a moment. "Daniel Boone Carter was a good man," he said quietly. "Worked this land most of his life." Ethan glanced across the unfinished irrigation lines. "Looks like he had plans." "Oh, he did," Caleb replied. "Big ones." The older rancher turned back toward Ethan. But I'll be honest with you, he added. This land isn't easy. Ethan chuckled softly. I'm starting to figure that out. Caleb leaned against the fence post. Farming out here takes patience, he said, and a lot of hard work. His eyes moved across the broken irrigation lines and half-repaired pipes. You planning to run the place yourself? Ethan hesitated. I don't know yet. Caleb nodded slowly. Well, he said, pushing his hat back slightly, if you stick with it, you'll earn the respect of this land. He climbed back into his truck, but paused before closing the door. And Ethan? Yeah? Caleb glanced toward Ranger. Keep that dog close. Ethan frowned slightly. Why's that? Caleb started the engine. Because out here, he said, things have a way of testing you. The truck rolled slowly back down the driveway, leaving a trail of dust drifting across the field. Ethan watched it disappear over the hill. The wind moved softly through the grass again. Ranger stepped closer and sat beside him. Ethan looked out across the unfinished land, the broken irrigation lines, the silent tractors, the endless fields waiting for someone to understand them. He let out a long breath. You hear that, partner? He said quietly. Ranger's ears lifted. Looks like we've got work to do. The wind moved slowly across the Carter Ridge fields as Ethan Walker stood staring out over the unfinished land. The quiet stretched in every direction, broken only by the faint rattle of loose irrigation pipes shifting in the breeze. For the next few days, Ethan settled into a routine. Morning came early on the plains. The sun rose wide and bright above the Flint Hills, and the land warmed quickly under the open Kansas sky. Ethan spent most of his time outside, working his way across the property piece by piece. Some problems were simple: loose valves, disconnected pipe joints, rust that needed cleaning. Others were harder. The smallest tractor refused to run no matter how long Ethan studied its engine. Several sections of irrigation lines still ended in bare dirt, pointing toward distant fields that had never been completed. It was like walking through someone else's unfinished thoughts. Ranger followed him everywhere. The German shepherd moved constantly along the edges of the fields, nose low to the ground, ears alert. Sometimes he paused suddenly and stared across the grass, as if listening to sounds Ethan couldn't hear. Old habits from military work never faded completely. Late one afternoon, Ethan stood beside the barn, tightening a loose hinge on the sliding door, when Ranger let out a low, warning bark. Ethan turned. A black SUV was rolling slowly down the dirt driveway. The vehicle looked strangely out of place against the wide Kansas landscape. Its polished paint reflected the afternoon sunlight like glass, and its tires kicked up a thin trail of dust as it approached the farmhouse. Ranger stepped closer to Ethan. The SUV stopped near the porch. A man stepped out. He wore an expensive gray suit that seemed far too clean for a working farm. His shoes were polished, his dark hair neatly combed back, and a thin silver watch glinted on his wrist as he adjusted his cuff. The man smiled politely as he walked forward. Mr. Ethan Walker, I presume? Ethan wiped his hands on a rag and nodded once. That's me. The man extended his hand. Victor Langley. Ethan shook it. The man's grip was firm but brief. I represent Langley Agricultural Development, Victor said smoothly. We manage several large farming operations across this region. Ethan glanced at the SUV, then back at the man. What can I do for you? Victor looked around the property with a slow, thoughtful expression. It's quite a place you've inherited, he said. Ethan didn't answer. Victor continued. Carter Ridge Farm has significant potential, excellent soil quality, strong irrigation possibilities, and a location that sits right between several important supply routes. He turned back to Ethan. Which brings me to my visit. Ranger watched the man closely, his amber eyes steady and unblinking. Victor clasped his hands together. Our company is interested in purchasing this property. Ethan raised an eyebrow. You drove all the way out here to make an offer? Victor smiled. We believe it would be a mutually beneficial arrangement. He reached into a leather folder and pulled out a document. I'm prepared to offer you a very generous sum. Ethan didn't take the paper. How generous? Victor named a number. Even without farming experience, Ethan knew it was a large amount of money. Enough to buy a house. Enough to start over somewhere else. Victor noticed the hesitation and leaned slightly closer. You see, Mr. Walker, land management can be very demanding, especially for someone new to agriculture. His voice remained polite. But companies like ours specialize in handling these operations efficiently. Ethan glanced out across the fields again. The unfinished irrigation lines, the broken tractor, the land Daniel Boone Carter had trusted him with. He turned back to Victor. Appreciate the offer, Ethan said calmly, but I'm not selling. Victor's smile didn't disappear, but it changed slightly. I understand you may want time to consider it. No, Ethan replied. I don't. For a moment the wind moved quietly between them. Victor slipped the paper back into his folder. Well, he said lightly, should you change your mind, my office is always open. He nodded toward Ranger. That's quite a dog you have there. Former military K9, Ethan said. Victor studied the dog briefly. Impressive. He walked back toward the SUV, but before opening the door, he paused. I'll leave you with one small piece of advice, Mr. Walker. Ethan waited. Victor rested one hand on the roof of the vehicle. Running a place like this alone can become overwhelming. His smile returned. And sometimes it's better to accept help before problems start appearing. Then he climbed into the SUV and drove away. Dust drifted slowly through the sunlight as the vehicle disappeared over the hill. Ethan stood silently beside the barn. Ranger let out a quiet growl deep in his chest. Yeah, Ethan muttered. I didn't like him either. The next morning, the first strange thing happened. One of the irrigation valves Ethan had repaired the day before had been turned completely open during the night. Water had flooded part of the lower field, leaving a muddy mess across the soil. Ethan frowned as he closed the valve. I know I shut that yesterday, he said quietly. Ranger sniffed the ground nearby. Later that afternoon, Ethan noticed something else. One of the toolboxes in the barn had been opened. A wrench set was missing. The following night, Ranger began barking sharply toward the far edge of the property. Ethan stepped outside with a flashlight. But whoever had been there was already gone. The wind carried only the quiet rustling of grass beneath the dark sky. Ethan stood on the porch a long time after that. Ranger sat beside him, watching the darkness. Across the empty fields, something about the land no longer felt peaceful. It felt watched. And Ethan Walker began to suspect that Victor Langley's visit had not been the end of the conversation. It had only been the beginning. The next few days passed with a strange tension hanging over Carter Ridge Farm. Nothing openly hostile happened, but small things continued to go wrong. Another irrigation valve was opened during the night. A section of fence along the western pasture had been cut clean through with bolt cutters. One of the barn doors had been left wide open, banging against its frame in the wind when Ethan found it in the morning. Each time, Ranger reacted first. The German Shepherd moved across the property with heightened alertness, pausing often to sniff the ground or stare toward the distant hills. Someone had been on the land. Ethan was sure of it. But whoever it was never stayed long enough to be seen. By the fourth evening, the sky began to change. Dark clouds gathered slowly across the horizon, rising like a distant wall over the Flint Hills. The wind shifted direction, carrying a damp heaviness that pressed down across the plains. Caleb Torres's truck appeared at the end of the driveway just before sunset. The older rancher stepped out and looked toward the sky. "You see that front coming in?" Caleb asked. Ethan followed his gaze. Thunder rumbled faintly in the distance. "Looks like a storm," Ethan said. Caleb shook his head. "Not just a storm," he replied. "That's a plains squall. Wind's gonna hit hard tonight." Ethan glanced toward the barn. "Anything I should do?" Caleb pointed toward the cattle pasture near the southern fence line. "If you've got animals out there, get them close to shelter. Storm like this can scatter them." Ethan nodded. "Appreciate the warning." Caleb climbed back into his truck. "And Ethan," he added before driving off, "secure anything loose." By the time darkness settled across the farm, the storm had arrived. The wind came first. It swept across the plains in powerful bursts that rattled windows and bent the tall grass flat against the ground. The trees near the farmhouse groaned under the pressure of the rising gusts. Then came the thunder. A deep crack rolled across the sky like distant artillery. Ethan froze. For a moment he was no longer standing in the Kansas farmhouse. Dust filled his lungs. The sky burned orange above a desert valley. The roar of explosions echoed across the hills. His heart began pounding. Ranger moved instantly. The German shepherd pressed against Ethan's leg, nudging him firmly with his shoulder. Ethan blinked hard and forced himself back into the present. "Easy," he whispered. The thunder cracked again. Rain slammed suddenly against the roof, drumming across the metal panels of the barn like 1,000 hammer blows. Then a loud metallic crash echoed across the property. Ranger barked sharply. Ethan grabbed his flashlight and stepped onto the porch. Wind whipped rain sideways across the yard. The barn doors were swinging violently. "Damn it," Ethan muttered. He ran toward the barn with Ranger beside him. Inside, chaos had already begun. A section of roofing metal had torn loose under the wind, allowing rain to pour into the upper loft. Loose hay bales had toppled from their stacks, and the frightened cattle in the nearby enclosure were pushing against the gates. Thunder roared again. The sound slammed into Ethan like a physical force. For a moment, his body locked. The battlefield rushed back again. Smoke. Sirens. Men shouting orders. He felt his breathing tighten. Then Ranger barked loudly and shoved against his leg. Ethan focused on the dog. Ranger's eyes were steady. Grounded. Here. Now. Ethan forced himself to breathe slowly. "I'm good," he said through clenched teeth. The cattle gate rattled violently as another gust of wind tore across the fields. If the animals broke through the fence, they could scatter for miles. Ethan moved quickly. He grabbed a length of rope from the barn wall and secured the loose door before sprinting toward the pasture. Rain poured down his face as he reached the fence line. The cattle were panicking. The gate had partially broken loose from the storm. Ethan pushed through the mud and forced it back into place, tying it tightly against the post. "Ranger!" he shouted. The German shepherd ran along the edge of the pasture, barking sharply and circling the herd. Years of training showed in every movement. The dog guided the animals away from the broken fence and toward the shelter of the barn. The storm raged for nearly an hour. Wind screamed across the hills. Rain flooded the lower field. Lightning split the sky again and again, but slowly the chaos began to settle. By the time the thunder faded into the distance, the cattle were secure inside the barn. Ethan leaned heavily against the wooden wall, soaked to the bone. His chest rose and fell as he caught his breath. Ranger trotted over and sat beside him. Mud clung to the dog's fur, but his tail wagged slowly. Ethan reached down and scratched behind the dog's ear. "Good work, partner," he said quietly. The wind softened. Rain slowed to a gentle drizzle. Across the dark fields of Carter Ridge Farm, the storm clouds finally began drifting east. Ethan looked out across the land. For a moment he realized something he hadn't felt in years. The storm had come, and he had faced it. Not as a soldier, not as a man running from the past, but as someone responsible for the ground beneath his feet. And somehow, in the middle of thunder and rain, he had held the line. The storm moved east during the night, leaving Carter Ridge Farm quiet beneath a pale gray sky. By morning, the wind had calmed, and the fields glistened with thin ribbons of water that reflected the early sunlight. Ethan Walker stood beside the barn, surveying the damage. The storm had not destroyed the farm, but it had certainly tested it. One section of the barn roof had peeled back like the lid of a can, exposing the upper loft to the rain. Several irrigation pipes had shifted under the pressure of the wind, and the southern field had partially flooded from the earlier valve sabotage. Still, the cattle were safe. The fences held. The farmhouse still stood strong against the plains. Ethan wiped rainwater from the brim of his hat and let out a slow breath. "Could have been worse," he said quietly. Ranger trotted across the muddy yard toward him, shaking droplets of water from his coat. The German shepherd's fur was still damp from the night's storm, but his amber eyes were bright and alert. The dog stopped beside Ethan and looked toward the barn roof. Ethan followed his gaze. "Yeah," he muttered, "we'll start there." The next few hours passed with slow, steady work. Ethan climbed onto the barn roof with a hammer and a box of spare nails he had discovered in the tool shed. The metal panels rattled under his boots as he carefully secured the loose sheets back into place. Below him, Ranger paced the ground, watching every movement as if supervising the repairs. The sky gradually cleared as the morning stretched on. By midday, sunlight spilled across the farm once again. After climbing down from the barn, Ethan headed toward the farmhouse to wash the mud from his hands. Inside, the house felt quieter than before. Not empty, just still. As if the walls were holding the memory of someone who had once walked those rooms every day. Ethan poured himself a glass of water from the kitchen sink and leaned against the counter. Ranger wandered through the living room and disappeared down the hallway. A moment later, the dog barked softly. Ethan frowned. "What is it?" Ranger barked again. Ethan followed him up the narrow wooden staircase to the second floor. The upper floor held only two small rooms. One was a bedroom, simple and orderly, with a neatly made bed and a wooden dresser beside the window. The other room looked like a study. Dust floated through the beams of sunlight streaming through the curtains. Wooden shelves lined the walls, filled with binders, old books, and stacks of papers. A heavy wooden desk sat near the far wall. Ranger stood beside it. The dog's nose hovered over an open drawer. Ethan stepped closer. Inside the drawer lay a thick, leather-bound notebook. The cover was worn from years of use. Ethan picked it up carefully. The first page held a name written in strong, steady handwriting. Daniel Boone Carter. Ethan sat down slowly in the chair and opened the journal. The entries stretched back several years. Most of them were simple records: weather notes, soil reports, sketches of irrigation layouts. But as Ethan flipped through the pages, the scale of Carter's vision began to reveal itself. This had not been a small family farm. Carter had been building something larger. Detailed diagrams showed irrigation networks stretching across the entire property. There were notes about crop rotation, water conservation, and plans for expanding the fields into the southern hills. One entry read, "If the western irrigation branch is completed, the southern fields could support wheat yields large enough to supply several nearby towns." Ethan turned another page. Another note followed several months later. "Local farming is disappearing. Corporate operations are swallowing everything. But smaller farms like this could still feed communities directly if the system is built right. Ethan leaned back in the chair. The old farmer had not simply been growing crops. He had been designing a system, a farm that could support entire towns. Ethan continued reading. Then he reached an entry written roughly a year before Carter's death. The handwriting was shakier, the lines slightly uneven. The doctors say I should slow down now. Ethan felt his chest tighten slightly. But there is still work left on the land. The next line stopped him. I find myself thinking often about the young Navy man who saved my life in Syria. Ethan stared at the page. Ranger stepped closer and rested his head gently against Ethan's knee. Ethan continued reading. He did not know my name. I barely knew his. But that moment gave me the chance to come home again. The next sentence had been written slowly, almost carefully. The man who pulled me into that evacuation truck deserves land worth fighting for in peace. Ethan closed the journal. For a long moment he sat in silence. Outside, the wind moved gently through the tall Kansas grass. Ranger's breathing was steady beside him. Ethan looked around the study again. The shelves, the maps, the careful notes left behind by a man who had believed in something bigger than himself. For years, Ethan had believed the war had taken everything from him. But here, in this quiet farmhouse, the truth felt different. One moment in that distant valley had not only saved a life, it had built a future. Ethan rested his hand on Ranger's head. Looks like we inherited more than a farm, he said softly. Ranger's tail thumped gently against the floor. Ethan looked down at the final page of the journal. There was one last note written in Carter's uneven handwriting. If Ethan Walker ever finds this place, I hope he understands. This land was never meant to belong to one man. It was meant to serve people. Ethan closed the book slowly. Outside the farmhouse window, the fields of Carter Ridge stretched toward the horizon. The work ahead was still enormous. But for the first time since arriving in Kansas, Ethan Walker understood why the farm had been left to him. The journal remained on the desk long after Ethan closed it. Dust drifted slowly through the warm afternoon light of the study. Outside, the wind brushed gently across the Kansas plains, bending the tall grass in soft, rolling waves. Ethan stood and walked toward the window. The land stretched endlessly beyond the farmhouse. Fields that had once been half-finished now looked different to him. Not abandoned, not broken, incomplete. Daniel Boone Carter had not run out of vision. He had run out of time. Ranger nudged Ethan's leg. The German shepherd's ears were lifted again, focused on something outside. What is it? Ethan asked quietly. Ranger turned and trotted toward the stairs. Ethan followed. The dog moved quickly across the yard and out toward the western edge of the property, where several irrigation lines stretched toward the hills. The ground there was dry. Too dry. Ethan had noticed it earlier in the week. One section of land had remained stubbornly barren despite the irrigation system Carter had installed. Ranger slowed near a patch of tall grass beside one of the main irrigation pipes. Then he began digging. Dirt flew backward as the dog clawed rapidly at the soil. Easy, buddy, Ethan said as he approached. But Ranger kept digging. Within seconds, the dog uncovered a section of metal pipe buried just beneath the surface. Ethan crouched beside it. That's odd, he muttered. He brushed the dirt away with his hands. The pipe was old but sturdy, its surface marked with faded welding seams. It ran at a slight angle beneath the ground, extending toward the western hills. Ethan followed its direction with his eyes. This isn't on the surface system, he said quietly. Ranger barked once. Ethan stood. Let's see where it goes. The two of them followed the pipe's direction across the field. The buried line stretched farther than Ethan expected. 200 yards, 300. Eventually, the pipe disappeared into a low patch of ground near the base of a small hill. The soil there looked darker, moist. Ethan knelt and pushed his fingers into the dirt. It was cool and damp. Ranger sniffed the ground intensely before pawing again at the soil. Within seconds, water began pooling slowly in the shallow hole. Ethan's eyes widened. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered. He dug deeper. The soil gave way easily, revealing a narrow channel where clear water was slowly rising through the earth. A natural spring. Ranger stepped back as the water bubbled gently from the ground. Ethan sat back on his heels. "That's what you were hiding," he murmured. He stood slowly and looked across the farm again. Suddenly, the irrigation maps in Carter's journal made sense. The buried pipe Ranger had discovered wasn't random. It was the central artery of the entire irrigation network. If connected properly, the spring could supply water to the entire southern section of the property. Hundreds of acres. Enough to support crops even during the driest Kansas summers. Ethan wiped the dirt from his hands. "So that's why Carter was expanding the system," he said. Ranger wagged his tail proudly. Late that afternoon, Ethan drove to Caleb Torres's ranch. Caleb was repairing a section of fencing when Ethan pulled up. "You look like a man who just found something interesting," Caleb said, as Ethan climbed out of the truck. Ethan nodded. "You know anything about underground springs around here?" Caleb raised an eyebrow. "Why?" Ethan explained what Ranger had uncovered. Caleb listened quietly. Then the older rancher whistled softly. "Son," he said, "if you've got a spring feeding that irrigation system, you're sitting on something mighty valuable." "How valuable?" Ethan asked. Caleb leaned against the fence. "Water rights out here mean everything," he said. "Most farms around here rely on seasonal rain or county distribution systems." He nodded toward the direction of Carter Ridge. "But if your land has its own spring feeding an irrigation network," he shrugged, "you're looking at enough water to grow crops even when the rest of the valley dries out." Ethan felt a slow realization forming. "That's why Victor Langley came," he said quietly. Caleb nodded. "Wouldn't surprise me." The older rancher looked out toward the distant hills. "Corporations like Langley Agricultural don't chase land," he said. "They chase water." Ethan glanced back toward Carter Ridge, the hidden spring, the unfinished irrigation network, the sabotage that had started shortly after Langley's visit. It all lined up. "They wanted the farm because of the water," Ethan said. "Exactly," Caleb replied. The sun dipped lower toward the horizon as Ethan drove back to Carter Ridge. The golden light of evening stretched across the fields. When he stepped out of the truck, Ranger was already waiting beside the farmhouse porch. Ethan looked toward the western hills. Somewhere beneath that soil, the spring continued to flow quietly through the underground pipe, a resource most people in the valley didn't even know existed. Victor Langley probably did. And if Ethan Walker was right, that meant the fight for Carter Ridge Farm had just become far more serious. The sun disappeared behind the western hills, leaving Carter Ridge Farm wrapped in a quiet blue twilight. Long shadows stretched across the fields, and the wind softened into a low whisper moving through the tall grass. Ethan stood on the porch of the farmhouse, watching the land settle into darkness. Ranger lay beside the steps, his head resting on his paws, but his ears remained alert. Neither of them fully relaxed anymore. The discovery of the underground spring had changed everything. Ethan now understood why Victor Langley had appeared so quickly. It was never about buying farmland. It was about controlling the water beneath it. The spring meant Carter Ridge could supply irrigation across hundreds of acres, even during dry seasons. In a region where drought could ruin entire harvests, that kind of water access was worth a fortune. and men like Langley didn't give up easily. By midnight, the farm had gone completely silent. Clouds drifted slowly across the moon, leaving the land in alternating patches of silver light and deep shadow. Inside the farmhouse, Ethan sat at the kitchen table cleaning a flashlight, while Ranger rested near the door. Suddenly, the dog's head lifted. A low growl vibrated in his chest. Ethan looked up. "What is it?" Ranger stood, the dog's gaze fixed on the dark window facing the western field. Ethan walked quietly to the porch and stepped outside. The air was cool and still. For a moment there was nothing. Then, far across the field, headlights appeared. Two beams of pale light moved slowly along the dirt road near the edge of the property. Ethan's jaw tightened. "They're back," he muttered. Ranger stood beside him, muscles tense. The headlights stopped near the irrigation lines. The engine shut off. 3 figures climbed out of the truck. Even from a distance, Ethan could see they were carrying tools. "Stay close," he whispered to Ranger. They moved quietly through the darkness, keeping low along the fence line. The tall grass helped conceal their approach as they crossed the field. When they were close enough, Ethan could hear metal clanging softly. One of the men was kneeling beside the main irrigation valve. Another held a flashlight. The third man stood watch near the truck. "They're cutting the line," Ethan murmured. If the irrigation system was destroyed, the southern fields would dry out. Without water, the farm would fail within months. That was the goal. Make the property worthless. Force Ethan to sell. Ethan stepped forward. "That's far enough." The 3 men spun around. The man with the flashlight aimed the beam directly at Ethan's face. "Who the hell are you?" one of them snapped. "You're standing on my land," Ethan replied calmly. The man holding the wrench straightened slowly. "We're just fixing a valve." "Funny," Ethan said. "Looks more like you're breaking one." Ranger stepped forward with a deep, warning growl. The men noticed the German shepherd immediately. "That dog better stay back," one of them muttered. "He will," Ethan said, "unless you give him a reason not to." For a moment the wind moved quietly across the dark field. The 3 men exchanged glances. Finally, the one holding the wrench tossed it into the truck bed. "Let's go," he muttered. They climbed back into the vehicle. The engine roared to life. Before the truck pulled away, the driver leaned out the window. "You should take Langley's offer," he called. "Next time we might not be so friendly." The truck sped away down the dirt road, disappearing into the darkness. Ethan stood still until the headlights vanished over the hills. Ranger barked sharply once, then ran several yards into the field before stopping. The dog returned quickly, tail raised, proud of having driven the intruders away. Ethan crouched and scratched behind Ranger's ears. "Good work," he said quietly. He walked to the irrigation valve the men had been working on. They had already loosened several bolts. Another few minutes and the entire section of pipe would have collapsed. Ethan tightened the bolts again with the wrench they had left behind. When he finished, he stood slowly and looked out across the fields. The farm was quiet once more, but it no longer felt peaceful. It felt like contested ground. Ranger stood beside him, scanning the darkness with the sharp instincts of a trained K9. Ethan placed a hand on the dog's back. "They're not done," he said softly. The wind carried the faint rustling of grass across the hills. Ethan looked toward the farmhouse lights glowing in the distance. For the first time since arriving in Kansas, he realized something clearly. This land was no longer just a second chance. It was a battlefield, and Carter Ridge Farm was worth defending. The following days passed under a heavy sense of watchfulness. Ethan Walker no longer moved across Carter Ridge Farm like a man exploring new land. He moved like someone protecting it. Every gate was checked twice. Every irrigation valve was tightened and locked. Every night, he walked the perimeter of the property before turning in, Ranger pacing silently beside him through the tall Kansas grass. The dog sensed the tension as clearly as Ethan did. The sabotage attempt had confirmed what Ethan already suspected. Victor Langley wasn't finished. But the farm was beginning to change as well. The irrigation repairs Ethan completed earlier in the week started to show results. Water flowed again through the main pipe system, feeding the southern fields Carter had once planned to cultivate. Green shoots had already begun appearing across the soil. Life returning. Caleb Torres stopped by twice that week to help reinforce the damaged fencing. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest," Caleb said one afternoon as they hammered fresh boards into the western pasture gate. Ethan shrugged. "I'm not the one who started it." Caleb nodded toward Ranger, who was pacing slowly along the fence line. "That dog of yours is worth 3 hired guards," he said. Ranger barked once as if acknowledging the compliment. The sun was already beginning to drop toward the horizon when Caleb finally climbed back into his truck and headed home. Night settled slowly across the plains. The farmhouse lights glowed warmly against the dark fields, and the wind carried the quiet scent of freshly turned soil. Inside the barn, Ethan worked beneath the yellow beam of a hanging lamp. The tractor engine lay open in front of him as he carefully cleaned one of the fuel lines. Ranger rested nearby. The dog's head lay on his paws, but his ears twitched with every unfamiliar sound. Ethan wiped grease from his hands and leaned back. "Almost there," he muttered. At that moment, Ranger's head lifted sharply. A low growl formed in his throat. Ethan froze. "What is it?" Ranger stood and walked toward the barn entrance. Outside, faint headlights appeared again along the distant edge of the property. Ethan cursed under his breath. "They're back." This time the truck didn't stop near the road. It drove straight toward the barn. The engine cut suddenly. Doors slammed. 3 shadows moved quickly across the yard. Ethan stepped out of the barn. "Looking for something?" he called into the darkness. The men stopped. One of them laughed quietly. "Told you he'd still be here." Another man stepped forward. "You had your chance to sell," he said. Ethan recognized the voice from the previous night. "Not interested," Ethan replied. The man lifted a heavy metal bar from the truck bed. "We're not asking anymore." Ranger stepped forward immediately, his deep growl cutting through the darkness like a warning siren. "Call off the dog," one of the men snapped. "Then leave my property," Ethan answered calmly. For a moment, no one moved. Then one of the intruders suddenly lunged toward the irrigation control box beside the barn. He raised the metal bar. Ranger exploded forward. The German Shepherd moved faster than the eye could follow. A blur of black and tan fur slammed into the man's arm before the bar could strike. The intruder shouted in shock as he stumbled backward. The other 2 men rushed forward. Ethan grabbed the fallen metal bar and stepped between them and the irrigation system. "Back up," he warned. One of the men swung wildly. Ethan sidestepped the blow and shoved him back against the truck door. But in the chaos, another man kicked toward Ranger. The German Shepherd yelped sharply. Ethan's heart stopped. "Ranger!" The dog staggered but remained standing. The men hesitated. The sound of an approaching engine suddenly echoed down the dirt road. Headlights appeared over the hill. Caleb's truck. The intruders swore under their breath. "Let's go!" They scrambled back into their vehicle and sped away into the darkness. Ethan dropped the metal bar and rushed to Ranger. The dog was breathing heavily. A dark patch of blood stained the fur along his shoulder. "Easy, easy," Ethan whispered, kneeling beside him. Ranger tried to stand tall, tail still wagging faintly as if nothing had happened. But Ethan could see the pain in the dog's eyes. "We're going to the vet," Ethan said. He lifted Ranger carefully into the truck and drove through the night toward the small-town clinic Caleb had once mentioned. The road blurred past beneath the headlights. Ethan kept one hand on Ranger's side the entire drive. "Stay with me, partner," he murmured. The clinic lights were still on when they arrived. Dr. Melissa Grant, a quiet veterinarian in her early 40s, opened the door immediately when she saw the injured dog. "What happened?" she asked. "Farm trouble," Ethan said. Melissa worked quickly, cleaning the wound and examining Ranger's shoulder. After several tense minutes, she stepped back. "He's lucky," she said. "The injury looks worse than it is. No broken bones." Ethan let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. Ranger lifted his head weakly and nudged Ethan's arm. "You scared the hell out of me," Ethan whispered. Melissa smiled softly. "That dog would walk through fire for you." Ethan looked down at Ranger. The German shepherd's eyes were steady, loyal, unbreakable. Ethan rested his hand gently on the dog's neck. "And I'd do the same for him." Outside the clinic window, the Kansas night stretched quiet and dark across the plains. But Ethan Walker understood something clearly now. The fight for Carter Ridge Farm had already demanded a price, and Ranger had just paid part of it. Morning light crept slowly across the small veterinary clinic in Ashford, Kansas. Ethan Walker had not slept. He sat in a wooden chair beside the examination table, one arm resting gently across Ranger's back. The German shepherd lay quietly beneath a thin blanket, breathing slow and steady, while the pain medication Dr. Melissa Grant had given him began to wear off. Outside the window, the prairie wind moved through the early morning fields. The world felt calm again. But Ethan's mind still replayed the moment in the barn. The swing of the metal bar, the sharp yelp when Ranger was struck, the sight of blood in the dog's fur. He reached down and rubbed behind Ranger's ears. "You didn't have to do that," he whispered. Ranger opened one amber eye and thumped his tail weakly against the metal table. Dr. Melissa Grant entered the room carrying a clipboard. "He's strong," she said gently. "Another few inches and that kick could have shattered his shoulder." Ethan nodded quietly. "Thank you for staying late." Melissa smiled. "Out here, farm dogs are family. Everyone knows that." She studied Ethan for a moment. "This wasn't an accident, was it?" Ethan shook his head. "No." Melissa set the clipboard down. "Then you should know something," she said. "People in this valley don't take kindly to outside corporations trying to bully their neighbors." Ethan looked up. "What do you mean?" Melissa leaned against the counter. "Victor Langley has been sniffing around this area for months," she explained, "trying to buy up land quietly. Most folks turned him down." Ethan frowned. "And Carter Ridge? That farm sits right over the largest groundwater pocket in this part of the county," she said. Ethan exhaled slowly. "Yeah, I figured that out." Melissa nodded. "Well, word spreads fast in small towns, especially when men start sneaking onto someone's property in the middle of the night." By late morning, Ethan was driving Ranger back toward Carter Ridge. The dog sat upright in the passenger seat, his injured shoulder wrapped carefully in bandages. The drive across the plains felt different now. Ethan wasn't returning alone anymore. When the farmhouse finally came into view, Ethan noticed something unexpected. Several trucks were parked along the dirt driveway. Caleb Torres stood near the barn talking with 3 other farmers Ethan had never met before. They turned as the Silverado rolled to a stop. Caleb grinned. "Heard you had some visitors last night," he said. Ethan stepped out of the truck. "News travels fast." Caleb nodded toward the other men. "Meet the neighbors." One by one, the farmers stepped forward. Ben Harlow ran a cattle operation north of the valley. Isaac Dunn managed the grain storage warehouse near Ashford, and Marcus Reed owned several hundred acres of wheat fields along the southern ridge. Each of them shook Ethan's hand. Ben glanced toward Ranger in the passenger seat. "That the dog that chased those idiots off your land?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Yeah, that's Ranger." Isaac nodded toward the irrigation lines stretching across the fields. "Langley's company has been trying to pressure farmers for years," he said. "If they control the water here, they control the valley." Marcus crossed his arms. "And none of us want that." Ethan looked around at the group. "You're saying you want to help?" Caleb shrugged. "Carter was a good man. This farm fed half the town during drought seasons." He gestured toward the others. "And we'd rather see it stay in honest hands." Within hours, the quiet farmyard transformed into a place of activity. Ben brought extra fencing supplies. Isaac delivered replacement irrigation valves from the warehouse. Marcus arrived with 2 hired hands to repair the damaged barn roof. Even Dr. Melissa Grant stopped by later that afternoon to check on Ranger and drop off fresh bandages. The sound of hammers and tractors echoed across the land. The farm was alive. Ethan stood near the barn watching the work unfold. For months he had believed Carter Ridge was something he had to defend alone. But now the valley itself had arrived. Caleb walked over and handed him a bottle of water. "Feels different, doesn't it?" he said. Ethan nodded slowly. "Yeah." Across the yard, Ranger lay in the shade beside the porch, watching the farmers move across the fields. Even injured, the dog's ears remained alert. Guarding. Always guarding. Ethan looked out across the land. The irrigation system Carter had started was finally beginning to come together. Pipes were repaired, valves secured, and water flowed steadily across the southern fields. The hidden spring continued feeding the entire system beneath the ground. For the first time since the sabotage attempts began, Carter Ridge Farm no longer felt vulnerable. It felt protected. Caleb leaned against the fence beside him. "Langley's men won't like this," he said. Ethan followed his gaze across the fields. "That's fine," Ethan replied calmly. The wind swept softly through the golden grass. For the first time since arriving in Kansas, Ethan Walker felt something stronger than determination. He felt belonging. And Carter Ridge Farm was no longer just his responsibility. It had become the valley's. The seasons turned quietly across the Kansas plains. Spring came first. Soft rain warmed the soil and the fields began to wake. Rows of wheat pushed through the earth in steady green lines, spreading across the land that had once looked unfinished and forgotten. The irrigation system Daniel Boone Carter had designed now ran stronger than ever. Water flowed steadily through the underground pipe Ranger had discovered months earlier. The hidden spring beneath the western hill fed the entire network, reaching fields that had once been dry. Ethan Walker walked those fields almost every morning. Sometimes he carried tools, sometimes he simply walked with Ranger beside him, watching the sunrise roll slowly across the valley. The German shepherd's shoulder healed well. A faint scar remained beneath the fur, but the injury had not slowed him much. Ranger still patrolled the property with the same calm discipline he had learned during his years as a military working dog. The only difference now was the way the farmers greeted him. "Morning, Ranger," Caleb Torres would call whenever his truck rolled into the yard. The dog would lift his ears proudly, as if he knew he had earned the respect. Summer followed spring. The Carter Ridge fields stretched wide and golden beneath the sun. The wheat harvest was stronger than anyone expected for a farm that had been struggling just a year earlier. Grain trucks from Isaac Dunn's warehouse began making regular trips down the dirt driveway. Ben Harlow's cattle grazed peacefully in the western pasture. Marcus Reed often arrived with spare equipment whenever Ethan needed help maintaining the irrigation system. The valley had kept its promise. The farm was no longer standing alone. One evening near the end of harvest season, Ethan sat on the farmhouse porch, watching the sun dip slowly toward the horizon. Ranger rested beside the steps, his tail thumping lazily against the wood. The land looked different now. The once empty fields were alive with crops. The barn roof had been fully repaired. Fresh fencing surrounded the cattle pastures, and the irrigation pipes stretched confidently across the property. Caleb climbed the porch steps carrying 2 bottles of root beer. He handed one to Ethan. "You ever think about how close this place came to disappearing?" Caleb asked. Ethan nodded slowly. "Yeah." Caleb leaned against the railing and looked out across the fields. "Langley packed up after the sheriff started sniffing around those sabotage reports," he said. "Corporate lawyers hate attention." Ethan took a sip from the bottle. "Good." The wind carried the quiet rustling of wheat through the evening air. For a moment neither man spoke. Then Caleb gestured toward the farmhouse window. Inside the living room, a framed photograph hung on the wall above the bookshelf. It showed Daniel Boone Carter standing proudly beside his wheat field years earlier. Below the photo sat Ranger's old military K-9 badge, mounted carefully in a small wooden frame. "You did right by him," Caleb said quietly. Ethan followed his gaze. "I'm still trying," he replied. Autumn arrived soon after. The fields turned shades of gold and amber as the crops matured under the cooling skies. The Carter Ridge harvest was strong enough to supply several towns across the region that year. Exactly the vision Daniel Boone Carter had written about in his journals. Late one evening, Ethan stood near the western hill where Ranger had first uncovered the buried irrigation pipe. The hidden spring still flowed steadily beneath the soil. He crouched and brushed the grass aside, revealing the small marker he had placed there earlier in the season. A simple wooden post. Carved into the wood were 3 words. Carter Ridge Spring Ranger walked up beside him. Ethan scratched behind the dog's ears. "You found this place first," he said. The German shepherd wagged his tail. The sun began setting across the plains again. Golden light poured across the valley, touching the wheat fields, the barn roof, and the long lines of irrigation pipes that now carried life across the land. Ethan returned to the porch and sat in the old rocking chair Daniel Boone Carter had once used. Ranger settled beside him. The wind moved softly through the fields. For a long time, Ethan simply watched the land breathe beneath the fading sky. Years ago, war had taken everything from him. But one small moment, a rescue in a distant valley, had planted something he never expected. A second mission. Not one fought with weapons, but with patience, work, and the quiet loyalty of a dog who never left his side. Ethan rested his arm across Ranger's back. "Well, partner," he said softly, "I think we made it." Ranger lifted his head and looked out across the golden fields, and as the sun disappeared behind the Kansas horizon, Ethan Walker felt something he had not felt in many years. Peace. The war had ended long ago, but this land had given him the life that came after. If you believe a man should always stand his ground when something worth protecting is on the line, type yes down in the comments. Stories like Ethan and Ranger's remind us that loyalty, hard work, and a little courage can still build something good in this country. And if stories about grit, justice, and life out on the land speak to you, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.